Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I am here to kick off Chapter 10 and the rise of Jacksonian democracy. So obviously this is very much related to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, but before I get into that, I just want to mention that Jacksonian democracy is really this kind of political revival that's taking shape. And what's interesting is that it's also happening right alongside the market revolution. And it's also happening right alongside something that you're going to read about called the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious revival. So you're kind of starting to see more and more Americans involved in the economy, involved in politics, and involved in religion. So there are a lot of changes taking place here during Unit 4. But we're going to focus on those political changes. And as I mentioned, many of these are ushered in under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who is a Democrat that is elected to two terms and serves from 1829 to 1837. So, what exactly is Jacksonian democracy? To simply state it, it's really more and more average Americans are now becoming invested and a part of the political process. So, for instance, you'll notice that the voter turnout increases pretty significantly between 1836 and 1840. And this is due to something that's called universal white male suffrage. Essentially, many states used to have stipulations on who could vote. And those that could vote in many states were usually white male landowners or white male landowners of a certain religion. These property and religious qualifications are stripped away during this time. And I like to think that as the common man is becoming more involved in the economy, that's kind of trickling into politics as well. It's also important to note that while many common men do start voting in American elections, we still do not see any advancement in the voting rights of African Americans or women. However, there are some other changes. As I mentioned, the common man is becoming more invested in politics, and you may have recalled reading about something called a King Caucus in Chapter 10. And that essentially refers to the fact that instead of like small political parties in Congress choosing presidents, we now see the American people actually voting for their president. And for many, Andrew Jackson is going to be a political candidate and potential president that a lot of Americans are going to get behind. To speak just a little bit about Andrew Jackson, he's very different from past presidents that we've had since the beginning of our nation. He is, for all intents and purposes, a self-made man. He's had a very difficult childhood. He was orphaned at a young age, and he essentially had to kind of create his own destiny. He learned the art of law and became a lawyer. He moved out to Tennessee, where he became a wealthy planter and slave owner. And he did serve in Congress in both houses for a brief period of time. And if you guys are ever in the Nashville area in Tennessee, just outside of town is his home. This is the Hermitage, his old plantation that you can visit. You know it's my video if I include some vacation photos. But not only do Americans love his story, they love the fact that he's a war hero. And Americans love war heroes, and they love to elect them to the presidency. So he was really known for his fighting at the Battle of New Orleans, which ironically enough happened after the peace treaty was signed, ending the war with Britain. But nonetheless, he's a tough war hero. He made himself into a really successful gentleman from the South after a very difficult childhood. And his kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps story really resonates with a lot of Americans. He's not one of these wealthy, elitist Federalists that we've seen in the past, so he's very relatable. Throughout his presidency, he does make quite a few changes that one could argue is very reminiscent of Jacksonian democracy. And one that has a huge impact is known as the spoils system. So instead of politically appointed positions transferring from president to president, he believed that people who were loyal to him or loyal to the Democratic Party should have political positions regardless of political experience. So he ended up replacing approximately 10% of all federally appointed positions, as I mentioned, to friends or those who had been loyal to the party. As again, most presidents tended to keep people who had been appointed by past presidents in those positions. He also believed in like rotation. So what that meant is, if you are the Treasury Secretary, you should hold that position for maybe a year and then somebody else should hold it and vice versa. So he believed that by appointing people who were loyal and constantly rotating and bringing in new kind of fresh faces into these positions, it would alleviate against political corruption, although many of his enemies said that it did entirely the opposite. Okay. He has a very colorful presidency, as you guys are about to hear, but one situation that I do want to discuss is his bank veto. So we know from previous chapters that Alexander Hamilton was responsible for creating a national bank, and the national bank was one kind of central area that would manage the funds of the United States. And they were usually run by a board of directors, many of whom had ties to industry and manufacturing and were very wealthy. And so the national bank came up for recharter. So it was only in existence for a certain amount of time and it was about to expire. So when it came up to be rechartered, Andrew Jackson, again, a man of the West and a little bit of the South, the common man, he believed that the bank was being run by the elites, that these New England merchants and manufacturers didn't have the best interests of maybe kind of Western and Southern farmers at heart. So he questioned the constitutionality of the national bank. And again, that's not the first time in history that's happened. When Congress voted to recharter extend the lease, if you will, of the Second National Bank, he vetoed that recharter attempt. And when he was elected to his second term, he vowed to kind of destroy the bank by taking all of the federal funds, putting them into state banks, and also, which became known as pet banks, which is not supposed to be a positive term, and also required that land out west be paid for or backed in gold and silver, which began to devalue paper money, which, as you guys are going to hear about and read about, is going to lead to a financial panic that will take place after his presidency. So again, Andrew Jackson, very interesting, somewhat controversial figure, and you're going to hear a lot more about how he handled issues like Native Americans and states' rights in some future videos. So thank you so much, guys, for listening. Have a great day.
Hi guys, I'm here to talk to you about Andrew Jackson and Native Americans. First thing we need to know is that Andrew Jackson, before he was even president, had a long history of being a fierce Indian fighter. He had many campaigns to try to drive out Native Americans in Georgia, and especially helped the United States acquire Florida from the Spanish in 1819 because of his many Indian pursuits there. So again, Jackson had a long history of fighting against Native Americans, and once he becomes president, that policy is going to continue. Up until Jackson's presidency, the United States did not have a specific policy towards Native Americans, but that is going to change. When he becomes president, the United States adopts this removal policy. Prior to this, remember, Native Americans and whites just had their own skirmishes from time to time, but now it's going to become the official policy of the United States to remove Indians west. And so that is executed with, in 1830, the Indian Removal Act. Again, passed by Congress while Jackson was president, and this required the different tribes to move to present-day Oklahoma. And you can see the different routes, whether it's the Creek Indians in yellow, the Chickasaw in purple, the Seminole in red, and so forth, and the Cherokee as well in blue. So all of these Indians were forced to move west. Why? Because whites wanted the land for growing various crops. The Cherokee Indians in particular were a very advanced tribe. And it was interesting because sometimes the whites said that the Indians needed to be removed because they were uncivilized. But clearly it didn't matter what the case was. whites just wanted the land, because here you have Cherokee having many schools, sawmills, even some owned slaves. They had their own alphabet, their own newspaper. It did not matter. No matter what, Indians were being forced to move west. The Cherokee in particular tried to fight against the Indian Removal Act. They took it to court, and eventually, in a famous Worcester v. Georgia decision, the Supreme Court, led by John Marshall, actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation. They said that the United States did not have jurisdiction over that Native American land. Jackson, as he was president, didn't care. He basically kind of said, whatever, and said, all right, let's see the Supreme Court enforce the laws. And he just continued to remove the Indians. And so clearly an example of Jackson and the presidency overstepping their boundaries, seeing that he is supposed to be the one enforcing the laws. So with that, this is going to lead to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears refers to a specific forced march of the Cherokee Indians. And here you can see them being kind of forced at gunpoint to leave their homes and start this 650-mile journey westward. So they had to leave they were mostly located in Georgia, as you can see down here, and they had to go through the mountains up this way over to Indian Territory, or present-day Oklahoma. Notice this is one of your Quizlet terms. It's in red. Definitely know it. About 15,000 Cherokee were forced to go on this journey, mostly by foot. Imagine walking from here until basically Washington, D.C., all on foot. They were not given adequate food. All walks of life, all ages of Indians were forced to make this journey. And unfortunately, about a quarter of the Cherokee tribe, about 4,000 of them died along this way, hence the name Trail of Tears. So that explains how Andrew Jackson dealt with the Native Americans. Thanks, guys.
Hey, guys. So today we are going to discuss the growing conflict over sectionalism, which impacted Andrew Jackson's presidency, an event that we refer to as the nullification crisis. Now, in order for us to understand this event, we have to understand sectionalism itself, as well as the idea of states' rights. So let's get going on this. All right, so I want to begin by talking about what is sectionalism. Sectionalism is when people put the interests of their local region or section above the interests of their entire country. And throughout history, sectionalism has created a lot of conflict in which one region is pitted against another region. Now, we start to see the roots of sectionalism in the United States embedded in the market revolution. And we already talked about in this class how the forces of nationalism brought America together in the years after the War of 1812. Between 1790 and 1820, new technologies connected the United States in ways that they had never been connected before. And what ends up happening is each region begins to specialize in specific economic activities. So you've got the South becoming more reliant on cotton, but unfortunately also becoming also more reliant on slave labor to grow and harvest that cotton. The North starts to see the introduction of textiles. And then out West, you see larger amounts of food production. Now, these things actually connected these parts of the country together. Like the cotton that was being grown in the South fueled the textiles that were being manufactured in the North. And so these two parts of the United States are linked. But because they're specializing in one thing or another, they also start to see their economic needs differently, and they want different things out of their government. So, for example, the South wants the government to protect cotton production. They want the government to protect slavery, whereas the North wants the government to protect their manufacturing, and the West wants better transportation that will allow them to get their food to market. And so each region, because of their specialization, have different economic needs. And so this is going to lead to sectionalism, which we see play out in a number of events. Probably one of the best examples of this sectionalism is the divide over slavery. And we can see that with the Missouri Compromise. So when Missouri wanted to enter into the United States in 1819, they did so as a slave state. In fact, they were the first state that would enter into the United States from the newly formed Louisiana Territory outside of the state of Louisiana itself. And so this created a lot of division within America because there was increasing resistance in the North against slavery. a fact that the South kind of took as a direct threat to the cotton production that they were starting to become reliant on. And so there was a standoff in 1820 over whether or not Missouri should enter into the Union as a free or slave state. Ultimately, Henry Clay alleviated the tension by proposing and helping pass the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise entered Missouri as a slave state, and in exchange, Maine was entered in as a free state. Now, what that did was it maintained a political balance between free and slave states, 12 free states, 12 slave states, therefore making sure that each side felt like they were being politically treated fairly. But it also, in a great example of sectionalism, literally drew a line across the United States. That became known as the Missouri Compromise line here at 3630, and that line separated where slavery would be allowed in the future and where it wouldn't. Anything north of this line was supposed to be free, and anything south of this line would allow for slavery. So that kind of puts off the slavery debate, but we can see that these sectional tensions are building during this time period. We see it in other areas as well. So the way that our government would handle the development of the economy also led to tensions. So the American system, which was also proposed by Henry Clay, was a system to try to revitalize and kind of help the national economy grow. And so some of the elements of the American system included rechartering the Bank of the United States, which is how we see the formation of the Second Bank of the United States, protective tariffs that would protect northern manufacturing, and then internal improvements, which was the development of roads and canals, especially out west to link the West with the rest of the United States. Now, this also faced sectional tensions because not all parts of the country agreed to these types of laws or plans by the federal government. At this time period, internal improvements were probably the most controversial because especially southern states didn't feel like it was necessary that their tax dollars go to pay for a road that they would never even use, and that might not even be within their state. And so not all parts of the American system were passed because of ideas of sectionalism and differences in what each region of the country wanted economically. Now, that takes us to the next idea, which is states' rights. And states' rights also is going to contribute to tensions that build up towards the nullification crisis during Andrew Jackson's presidency. So the idea of states' rights, it involves this question of who is more powerful, the federal government or the state government. And there's long been a debate over where power should lie. And we can trace this all the way back to right after the Constitution was created. When the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1796, there was a number of people who thought that was the federal government going too far. The Democratic Republicans at the time, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, went as far as to say that states could nullify federal laws. And they made that argument in what became known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 1798. So this is an idea of nullification, that states have rights and that states should be more powerful than the federal government. That argument is going to play out throughout early American history. And we see a number of people using this argument that states can nullify laws. The Federalists used the same argument when they were opposing the Embargo Act in 1807. So these ideas of states' rights and sectionalism come to a head during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Now, Andrew Jackson himself was a firm believer in states' rights. We see him favoring states' rights in a number of issues. It's one of the reasons why he was concerned about the Second Bank of the United States. It also was one of the reasons why he sided with Georgia over the Cherokee Indians in the Indian Removal Act, and the later Worcester v. Georgia case. So he's definitely a supporter of states' rights, but he never favored disunion. But that isn't the case for everyone during this time period. So in 1828, what ends up happening is there's a new tariff that's passed. Now, tariffs were supposed to basically tax imported goods to make them more expensive so that people would be forced to buy American goods. And this was something that favored northern states. Northern states loved tariffs. And the southern states, on the other hand, who didn't manufacture anything, hated them. They saw it as a one-sided law that only really benefited the North and maybe like mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania and New York. And they felt like it was actually hurting their economy because their cotton never got any kind of similar protections. Not only that, but they favored like the growing power of the central government. If the central government could, increasingly tax and regulate the economy, what was to stop them from ending slavery? And so we see a growing outcry against this tariff, especially in the South and especially in South Carolina after 1828. Now, one of the leading figures who led this outcry against the tariff was John C. Calhoun, who was vice president under Andrew Jackson. And John C. Calhoun actually started his career as a war hawk, as a nationalist. But over time, he began to become an increasingly large supporter of not only sectionalism, but also of states' rights. And he argued that the state of South Carolina should have the right to nullify the tariff of 1828 and later tariffs that were passed by the federal government. The South Carolina got behind this idea. In fact, there is a lot of nullifiers in South Carolina, so much so that the people of South Carolina started actually knitting these palmetto cockades, which you see here, and wearing them as a symbol of states' rights and state resistance to the tariff of abominations. So what ends up happening is it creates a standoff between Andrew Jackson and the state of South Carolina, which becomes known as the nullification crisis. So the state of South Carolina actually holds a convention and declares that they're going to nullify the protective tariffs, which they see as unfair. There is even potential talk of secession at this point, that maybe they would leave the United States as a whole. This pits Andrew Jackson, who's president, against South Carolina. And like I said, Andrew Jackson supported states' rights, but not to the point where it could break the United States apart. And so what Andrew Jackson begins to do is he begins to speak out against the nullifiers, and he even begins to raise an army in order to potentially use against like South Carolina, who's talking about nullification. Now, what ends up avoiding this, bringing this crisis to an end is Henry Clay, who steps in and creates the Compromise Bill of 1833. And essentially what it does is it lowers the protective tariff and to a point where the South feels it's a little bit more reasonable, while at the same time giving Northern manufacturers some protection against foreign goods. And at the same time, the government also passes something called a force bill, which would authorize the president to use force against a state that was in defiance of the federal government. But what we see here, and the reason why this is so important, is that we see sectionalism and states' rights coming to a head, creating conflict over this issue of tariffs. And it got so point that they're so bad that at this point they're actually talking about, is this a crisis that could lead to a civil war? At this juncture, it does not, but it kind of sets the stage for growing tensions. And what ends up happening is as the debate shifts away from tariffs to the debate over slavery, it will become even harder to resolve these issues. And this is going to kind of foreshadow the oncoming of the Civil War.
Hey, A-Pushers, this is Mr. Crayson coming at you with another video, this time on President Andrew Jackson and the return of the two-party system. But first, let's contextualize. In order to understand how this two-party politics system came back, we first must understand that there was one party for a while during the era of good feelings. So just to recall, in December of 1814, the Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut at the Hartford Convention and spoke ill of the Democratic Republicans, spoke ill of the War of 1812 that they thought was a forever war they'd never get out of, that the Democratic Republicans started, and even spoke of potential secession of New England states. But of course dismissed that. However, they looked as un-American as can be as a result of this convention, and they soon started to lose their influence. The Federalist Party faded away, leaving only the Democratic Republicans for a bit. So we've got James Monroe, that is going to be kind of the heart of this era of good feelings for the Democratic Republicans. And he's elected to 2 terms in office. And here now in 1824, the election of 1824, this is where we'll get our 2 parties back. So let's go into that a little bit now. In the election of 1824, 4 Democratic Republicans ran for president. You had William Crawford, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams. When 4 people from the same party run, you're bound to split the vote in such a way that nobody gets a majority, and that's what happens. So Andrew Jackson did win a plurality in the popular vote, which means he won the most votes, but and in the Electoral College. However, you need a majority, which is over 50% of the Electoral College votes in order to win the presidency. So this election goes to the House of Representatives to be decided. And Henry Clay, who is lagging in the race, is going to throw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Both him and Adams don't like Jackson. So with Clay as Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives throwing his support behind John Quincy Adams, Adams will win the election in the House, making Adams the new president. So here's where things get spicy. We have John Quincy Adams giving Henry Clay the position of Secretary of State. Was this all a setup? That's what Andrew Jackson's going to say. Jackson will claim there was a corrupt bargain that was agreed to between Clay and Adams. This will stick for a lot of the Jackson supporters, and Jackson will really run this into the ground, crying corrupt bargain for 4 years until the next election, essentially. Okay, so now we have a President John Quincy Adams. And what's he about? Well, during the next 4 years, a new party will essentially form under Adams. It'll be called the National Republicans, and Jackson will meanwhile start forming this party of the Democrats. Jackson's form of Democrat is very similar to the Jefferson form of Democratic Republicans. The National Republicans of Adams will be very similar to the Federalists over time. In 1828, an election rematch will happen between Adams, the incumbent president, and Andrew Jackson. And what will happen is Jackson will completely mop the floor with Adams and win this election in a landslide. Let's contextualize again. In order to understand how the election of 1828 could have gone to this outcome with Jackson winning, one must first understand the rise of mass politics and universal white male suffrage. So slowly over time, with the addition of new states in the Ohio River Valley like Indiana and us, Illinois, and also in the Louisiana Territory with Missouri, we have new states that are getting rid of property requirements for voting. Most states had some sort of property requirement for white male citizens in order to vote. They had to have, owned a certain amount of property or paid a certain amount of taxes. States like Illinois will get rid of that requirement. So now it's open to all white male citizens. And this slowly started spreading to other already established states. They start rewriting their constitutions to include now universal white male suffrage. Now you have a much bigger voting population of people that are eligible to vote, and a lot of them are not highly, college educated. Many of them are what we would say are like the common man. And Jackson knows how to appeal to these common men. He himself says he was a common man because he did have a very modest upbringing initially. He will also really drive home that whole corrupt bargain accusation against Adams to get these common voters riled up. And it works. So in 1828, he wins that election by a landslide, and the Democrats now are in office. So in 1828, we've pretty much solidly created a two-party system again now. As president, some of the highlights of Jackson's career include not allowing the Bank of the United States to be rechartered. Congress had passed a rechartering bill in 1832, and he vetoes it. Why? He's the president of the common man, and the common man doesn't trust the national bank, who they accuse of being in the pocket of wealthy businessmen. He also starts initiating the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils, and in this case, The spoils of an election would be positions in government. So he starts giving away these positions, these bureaucratic positions, to people who voted for him, canvassed for him, helped him out. That is a very corrupt practice, as we have come to find out. And there's laws against that. The Pendleton Act in 1883 will put a stop to that and require civil service tests, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So the vice president for Andrew Jackson does not want to be his VP anymore. Calhoun resigns. A different vice president will be on the ticket. And in 1832, the Jackson-Martin Van Buren ticket wins. In 1833, the National Republicans and other Andrew Jackson-hating people will coalesce into the Whig Party. And so the name Whigs comes from the fact that in Britain, the party that was most anti-absolute monarchy was known as the Whigs at the time. So this is sort of like a tongue-in-cheek way of saying we're anti-King too. We're anti-Andrew Jackson. So what do the Whigs stand for? What was their platform? To make it easy on you, it was basically what the Federalists had stood for. So they are pro-American system, pro-protective tariffs for American manufacturing. They're pro-infrastructure paid for with federal dollars. They are for the national bank being rechartered. They are for stronger federal power or central governmental power. The leadership of the Whigs is largely Henry Clay, the congressman from Kentucky and Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams, and Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, the senator from Massachusetts, was also a power player for the Whigs. So Jackson serves 8 years as president, and he will honor Washington's farewell address in this way by not running a third time. He is going to endorse his vice president, Martin Van Buren, for the next election in 1836, and Van Buren will win. Historians like to look at this election as sort of a referendum on Jacksonian government policy. Some of Jackson's policies on the economy directly contributed to the Panic of 1837, which would be the U.S.'s first real depression. One such policy decision was the vetoing of the recharter of the National Bank. Another such policy was requiring gold and silver to be used to pay off buying land. The specie circular, as it was called, really devalued the paper money at the time because it required that you use gold or silver to make payments on land. And that too contributed to this panic. The Panic of 1837 wasn't really Martin Van Buren's fault, but he will pay for it dearly. In addition to a lot of allegations of him being not a common man, not a champion of the common man, but, he had golden spoons in the White House, people alleged. He was this privileged man and did not represent the common people anymore. So in the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison will play the common man card now. So he will take a page out of the book of Jackson, but this time for the Whigs. When we look at this election, it's kind of seen as one of the first sort of very modern elections where there's mass politicking going on. It was known as the log cabin and hard cider campaign because these log cabins on wheels would be rolled into these rallies and they'd start passing out hard cider to the crowd. And the crowd would get riled up and spirited. And, it was quite an event to go to one of these Harrison rallies. The 1840 election was also the birth of the campaign slogan. The slogan for Harrison was "Tip a canoe and Tyler too." It's pretty catchy. There's even a song written about it. And the story behind it is, William Henry Harrison was a war hero. So he fought in the Battle of Tippecanoe against the Shawnee. And this was back in 1811, right before the War of 1812. And he was the victorious general. So he got a lot of glory from that. And he's riding that glory. And John Tyler was his vice president. They win the 1840 election, and now we have a Whig in office. A really sad note about William Henry Harrison is he only gets to enjoy his presidency for 32 days, as he will, on his inauguration night, give the longest speech in presidency history, over 8,000 words long, will catch pneumonia and pass away. So his presidency is short-lived. John Tyler will take the helm. Tyler himself wasn't a very staunch Whig, so some of the Whig platform will get lost in translation during his presidency. You probably didn't know about the Whigs prior to APUSH, and there's a reason for that. They are short-lived. And in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act will pass. And this act is so infuriating to so many people that a brand new party will form overnight. It is the Republican Party, and most Whigs will fall in line with the Republican Party. Northern Whigs will go to the Republican Party. Northern Democrats will even go to the Republican Party. Free Soilers will go to the Republican Party, and even a number of know-nothings from the American Party will join the Republican Party. And that will really be the end of the Whigs, since they will be now aligned into the Republican Party. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but at that point, our two main parties will now be the Republicans and the Democrats, just like it is today. So how about that? We're finally getting to those modern two parties. So the two-party system is back and it's here to stay. And that concludes this video. Have a great one, guys.
For Tippecanoe and Tyler too. For Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with them we'll beat little Van. Van is a used up man. And with them we'll beat little Van.